Hello, Wonder. Tonight we won't be reaching for the stars, but sinking softly beneath the roots. Not the branches stretching skyward, not the gods above, but the quiet reasoning hidden deep below, where silence thinks in slow, echoing loops. Some secrets are never whispered upward, they echo downward instead. Yggdrasil's roots aren't just tangled in soil, they twist through time, memory, and forgotten intentions. A single drop of water may ponder for 1,000 years. A wandering breeze may stir the dust of old prophecies. Tonight we'll listen to the murmurs of the Norns spinning fate, to the hush that spills from a well buried in forever. Each realm has its own breath, its own silence, and we'll learn their rhythm. Somewhere, far from shore, beneath a weary sail, we may hear the faintest ripple, the stir of a serpent circling. So please, dim your light, settle your headphones gently, and if possible, find an open window. As the whispers of the roots rise upward, we'll follow, slowly inward and down. And if journeys like this bring you peace, you might consider subscribing. If you leave your time and place in the comments, perhaps the next tale will begin inside your dream. Now, if you're ready, we'll begin with the softest creak of a root. Don't worry, beneath Yggdrasil, there is no time. Only those who listen, asterisk. You might not expect the roots of a mythic ash tree to gossip. Yet somewhere in the hush beneath Yggdrasil, an almost polite rustle wonders whether you, of all people, brought a blanket tonight. A sigh of wind drifts through branches so old they have forgotten their own rings, and it carries the faintest crunch of ancient bark unpeeling like a sleepy yawn. Somewhere farther down, drops of water tap a secret rhythm at the well of urn, as though the Norns are knitting time together one soft plank at a time. They do not rush. Fate, apparently, has never needed a stopwatch. Tiny specks of starlight settle on the damp earth, and I could swear the moss is counting them just to pass eternity. A single root curls around a glimmering stone that hums, with the memory of 9 separate worlds balancing on an invisible spindle. The stone does nothing dramatic. It simply remembers. Above, the branches creak like elderly librarians shelving oversized tomes, and the air smells of distant pine smoke and an almost comically faint hint of mead someone spilled centuries ago. Every so often, a squirrel named Ratatosker lopes by, carrying insults between an eagle and a dragon, but tonight even his chatter feels muffled, as though he is reading each barb from a cue card in slow motion. You might notice, too, the water in the pool is never still. It tiptoes across its own surface, nudging silver ripples outward in patient rings that never quite end. Scholars once argued whether those ripples measure destiny. Personally, I think they just enjoy the exercise. Breathe in once more. The coolness you feel is time itself stretching its limbs. The ground softens into loamy twilight, and before you realize it, a different hush begins to speak. A hush scented with Alfheim's green glow, Svartalfheim's hearth fire, and the polished stillness of Vanaheim's gentle groves. Somewhere overhead, leaves catch the echo of distant forges, dwarves shaping metals nobody has ever named, each tap of the hammer falling like a courteous knock. Warm burrows of light slip beneath giant roots, touching stone corridors where seers trade soft prophecies and voices so low the vowels seem to recline. Occasionally, an owl blinks, decides wisdom can wait until morning, and promptly resumes. Napping. In Vanaheim, temple mists curl around smooth pillars, letting each realm breathe in its own meter slow, then slower, then something barely distinguishable from stillness. The stars here are shy. They peek out in 2s and 3s, perhaps worried a crowd would wake the listeners. You may hear the faint scrawl of runes etching themselves into memory, spelling nothing urgent, only gentle reminders that everything is more or less fine. A subtle ripple of salt folds over that thought, and suddenly we drift out toward a horizon no cartographer has dared to tidy up. The world serpent lies beneath glossy black waves, circling Midgard with the casual persistence of a ribbon. Tying a letter shut. Waves lap against weather-battered Viking hulls now moored for the night, their sails drooping like sleepy eyelids. A plank creaks, a rope groans, then settles. Somewhere on deck, a sailor whispers that the serpent's tail must arrive any moment now, and another sailor, too tired to comment, merely nods at the dark. If you lean in, you can almost hear Jarmungandr shift a single scale, and underwater, hush deeper than distance itself. Nothing dramatic surfaces, just a thoughtful bubble rising beside the moon. Ancient timbers rock so gently that the sky and sea trade reflections without fuss. You may notice your own heartbeat has slowed to match the tide. It tends to do that when longships stop pretending they need to go anywhere. The water flattens into mirror calm as dawn loiters beyond the rim of thought, and a pair of ravens take flight, feathers brushing dawn's first pale blush. They glide above the tree line, tips of wings skimming mist pockets like quills across parchment. Hugin thinks about thinking. Munin remembers remembering. Together they decide it. Might be amusing to wake Odin with news he already knows. Below them, frost twinkles on silent fields, catching the low purr of distant streams thawing into song. At the edge of vision, a single rune glows dull gold, waiting for someone to file it under miscellaneous enlightenment. Mimirs. Well, two mumbles an idea or two, but the echoes are as lazy as summertime midges hovering over water. Odin once traded an eye for wisdom here, some would call that steep. Others a bargain, yet tonight the well seems content to let knowledge drip one drop at a time. Each plash a barely audible punctuation mark in the story, you are almost done. Hearing. And now those ravens fold their wings, settling on a quiet branch as the first sun sliver slips between far-off peaks. Light spreads softly, the way butter melts on warm bread, and it leaves behind a glow that promises everything. We'll keep humming along, even if your eyelids finally surrender. Roots will continue their gossip, realms will keep breathing their separate lullabies, the serpent will keep circling, and a pair of curious birds will forever collect headlines that nobody is awake enough to read. So let your thoughts mosey, at their own unhurried pace. Let them wander, double back, and forget why they started. Because in the gentle hush beneath a mythic ash tree, the only urgent thing is the soft drift of sleep already brushing its fingertips across your brow, inviting you to dream of roots that whisper secrets too quiet to remember come morning. You might not imagine an entire orchard whispering about polishing schedules, yet here beneath a sky that still yawns open from last night, Idun traces one finger along a half-shining apple and wonders whether it prefers the left or right. Side turned toward dawn. A hush rides the light, pooling in cool pockets between tree trunks that lean just enough to gossip among themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster gives half a crow before deciding it is far too early for declarations. The orchard accepts the unfinished note like a sleepy compliment and goes back to listening to its own leaves breathe. Idun, wrapped in a shawl the color of unsweetened cream, hums a tune so soft it never quite finds a melody, and the apples polite as ever adjust their dim glow in response. If by some chance you remain conscious long enough to check whether your blanket is rearranged just so, feel free to press whatever little rune on your screen promises future stories about absolutely nothing urgent. Otherwise, keep letting eyelids grow heavier than ripe fruit. She chooses a cloth woven of spider silk and cloud fluff, one edge embroidered with a knot pattern nobody has tried to untangle since Tuesday. Each apple receives 3 strokes, top to middle, middle to bottom, bottom to somewhere beyond the notion of time. She could do 2 strokes, no council decree forbids shortcuts, but 3 feels tidy, like lining up socks in a drawer even though nobody inspects them. Every so often she pauses to record a gentle squeak in a small ledger, 1 column for shine intensity, another noting whether an apple sighed contentedly. The ledger has more empty space than notes, and that seems just right. A bee drifts past, half asleep, pockets of pollen swinging lazily like tiny saddlebags. Perhaps it thinks about international nectar exchange rates. Perhaps it thinks about nothing at all. Bracky, ever the supportive spouse, wanders through reciting half-finished verses, searching for a rhyme to do muddled, decides there is none worth effort, and leaves a peck of inspiration on a dun's cheek before meandering off in. Search of second breakfast dot by mid-morning the sunlight thins, stretching into ribbons that slither between branches and spill soft gold over mossy paths. Idun inspects the tree's ankles, she calls them ankles, though roots might argue for another term, and notes how some have acquired decorative spirals of lichen, like stubborn bracelets. She gently flicks a speck of dirt from a twig and murmurs an apology to the twig for startling it. A nearby sapling barely tall enough to offer a respectable bit of shade waves one timid leaf in thanks for the example. Somewhere above, a thrush practices a 10-note song, adding an unnecessary 11th note because perfection is overrated. At exactly the moment you wonder whether apples ever develop stage fright, Idun retrieves a small wooden box filled with tiny woolen hats, one for each apple that feels draft sensitive. Knit by Frigg on a particular leisurely afternoon, each hat sports a single loop stitch at the crown. Allegedly for ventilation, though, nobody takes the claim seriously. A light breeze wanders in from the direction of Bifrost, carrying faint hints of rainbow mist and the metallic ring of Heimdall polishing something far shinier than apples. Idun nods in that general direction, acknowledging the friendly competition, then resumes her own slower ritual. The breeze circles the orchard once, decides to stay for tea, and settles into the grass where it whispers gossip about cloud. Formations to passing ants. Some scholars insist that the ants offer insightful commentary. Other scholars maintain that scholarship is perhaps misapplied here and might be better spent napping. Idun marks a small star next to the ledger entry for the day's breeziest apple, purely as encouragement. Everyone appreciates positive reinforcement, even produced dot by afternoon. When shadows stretch long and drowsy across the ground, Idun takes a moment to sit on a low wooden stool whose legs are exactly uneven enough to wobble in a soothing rhythm. She opens a second ledger, this one devoted entirely to size, and reviews historical statistics, average sigh amplitude per bushel, correlation between sigh pitch and dew point, a footnote speculating that apples might dream of simpler shapes. She taps her quill thoughtfully, accidentally doodling a spiral that looks suspiciously like a snail on vacation. Off to her left, the orchard gate remains politely ajar. Legend says a giant once wandered in, intent on mischief, but became so relaxed he sat down, counted clouds, and forgot the mischief part entirely. Thor occasionally checks the story for accuracy. Thor has never finished the checking because the orchard ambience lulls him into calm silence long before he reaches the gate. Somewhere near the perimeter, a lone apple drops onto a cushion of moss with a sound softer than a polite cough in a library's sleepiest corner. Idun strolls over, inspects it for bruises, none save a faint blush of embarrassment, then tucks it into her apron for later polishing. The dropping of the first apple each afternoon marks what Idun calls apple o'clock, ideal for brewing. A very non-dramatic tea made from water teased into warmth by a candle flame. Steam meanders skyward and slow curls, considering various shapes before settling on indistinct. She sips, tastes notes of tranquility, sets the cup down, and continues. Sipping because tranquility is best enjoyed redundantly. A cloud passes overhead, pausing to admire its reflection on the polished fruit, then moves on with the lazy dignity of a swan gliding to no appointment whatsoever as daylight reclines behind distant hilltops. The orchard lights itself from within. each apple storing sunbeams during the day and releasing them now in a warm, pulse-like glow. Idun walks the rows, fingers brushing bark, murmuring good evenings to knots and scars alike. A sleepy vole scurries beneath a root, dragging a straw it claims will complete its nest aesthetic. Nest critiques are mercifully brief at this hour. Bragi reappears, holding a harp tuned deliberately out of tune so as not to jar anyone awake. He plucks a chord halfway, forgets about endings, and lets the note float unfinished into twilight. Nearby, a moth shaped like an errant punctuation mark flutters against a lantern, reconsidering its priorities, then drifts away to consult. A less opinionated source of light, night folds over the orchard like a blanket too gentle to tuck in, and silver mist rolls between trunks, making each tree appear to hover. Idun sets a final apple back on its branch, where it settles with the contentedness of a pebble finding the exact dent in the riverbed it had been saving. Above, stars begin their usual wink exchange, an elaborate system of quiet acknowledgments that even astronomers decline to formalize for fear of interrupting. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a wolf howls, that the sound softens on its way through layers of leaf and lullaby until it resembles a sigh of someone remembering they left the kettle on and deciding it can wait until morning. Idun kneels, presses, her ear to the earth as though listening for underground applause, hears only the slow heartbeat of soil, and smiles at its dependable tempo. Before retiring, she sprinkles a handful of dew gathered earlier into a shallow marble bowl. Myth insists this gesture seals freshness, though Idun mostly likes how the droplets chime against stone. She closes the ledger, tucks it beneath an apple print cushion, and glances at the trees, which now resemble faint lanterns bobbing on a sea of quiet. If you find your thoughts drifting like those lanterns, let them drift farther. They know the way back if ever needed. Idun extinguishes a single candle flame, folding inward without protest, and the orchard inhales, then exhales, settling into a silence so soft it feels almost imaginary. It is in this hush that the apples sleep, polished and hat-clad, unaware of their own significance. And Idun hums one last almost tune, a string of notes spiraling gently upward until they dissolve into night air, leaving only the impression of sound like footprints in fog. Tomorrow she will start again, 3 strokes per apple, 1 sigh per entry. No urgency whatsoever, because eternity, it seems, prefers routines that never quite finish. Now the orchard rests, the ledgers rest, even the breeze has dozed off mid-sentence, and you may notice your own breathing has sensed with the slow rise and fall of branches outside this story. Feel free to let the next sentence fade before you even reach its middle, letting each word drift apart like seed fluff in low wind, carrying nothing but the gentle promise that somewhere, long after you have slipped into your dreams, an apple will shine quietly in the dim light, content to wait for morning. You may be surprised to learn that a rainbow can sigh, yet tonight the Bifrost exhales a faint ribbon of mist while Heimdall tilts his head, listening for tones so subtle they hover just beneath hearing, like moth wings brushing parchment. Moonlight drapes itself over the bridge, scattering pale reflections that fold into one another with the unhurried grace of laundry left too long in a summer breeze. Heimdall, whose ears once heard grass seeds debating germination schedules, now lifts a small silver cloth and polishes a quiet smudge where violet meets indigo. No one else would notice the blemish. It is smaller than a forgotten comma, but a bridge connecting worlds deserves nothing less than immaculate punctuation. If you are still awake enough to wonder whether he buffs clockwise or anti-clockwise, feel free to guess. He never says, and speculation is half the lullaby. A low hum trembles beneath the arch, as though each color keeps its own tuning fork tucked away for nighttime rehearsals. Heimdall sets a slender lantern on the crystalline railing. Its flame barely flickers, reluctant to disturb whatever dream the bridge might be having. The lantern's glow mingles with amber bands in the span, and for a brief moment, the entire structure seems to sigh in contentment, like a house cat discovering a sun-warmed windowsill. Somewhere in the distance, a snowflake lands on a blade of midnight air, notes the absence of traffic, and decides not to melt out of respect for the quiet. Heimdall retrieves a quill carved from an egret feather gifted long ago by a bird who admired his posture in records tonight's first observation. Red Band appears especially thoughtful. Recommends slower footfalls tomorrow. His handwriting is meticulous, each rune reclining in perfect posture, yet the notebook's pages remain mostly blank, for nothing urgent ever happens when urgency is not invited. A gentle breeze wanders uphill from Midgard, carrying the muted aroma of haylofts and evening bread crusts. It swirls around the watchman's ankles before remembering it had no particular message and drifts off in search of unsupervised dandelions. Heimdall listens to the receding footsteps of that breeze the way a librarian listens to footsteps. In a hushed corridor, pleased there is motion, but happier still when it reaches a hush. He taps the bridge lightly with the blunt end of his horn, Jallarhorn, producing a tone so soft it would rather be a memory than a sound. Colors ripple outward in courteous acknowledgement, each hue checking in like sleepy passengers responding to a roll call. Orange admits to feeling slightly overcooked. Blue offers an extra ripple to compensate. Green volunteers to swap positions for variety, but quickly forgets the suggestion and resumes glowing. In his notebook, Heimdall writes, "Inter-pigment camaraderie satisfactory." Far below, the black river of night drifts past, ferrying constellations that have nothing more pressing to do than reflect on themselves. One star flutters an eyelash at another. We assume stars have eyelashes because why shouldn't they? And the other star blushes so faintly, the effect is visible, only to observers with patience measured in eons. Heimdall, never one to rush, allows the moment to finish blushing. He then circles the bridge, counting crystalline rivets for the third time this hour, although the count never changes and never surprises him. Rivet number 94 squeaks pleasantly when greeted. Rivet number 95 appreciates being counted, even if it has nothing profound to add. This ritual resembles someone rechecking whether they locked the door despite knowing they did. Yet unbefrased, such small assurances fold perfectly into the lullaby of routine. Somewhere around what mortals might call 2 in the morning, a snow bright hare appears at the bridge's threshold, sniffs the shimmer, and decides bedtime can be postponed for a scenic stroll. Heimdall nods an unspoken welcome, stepping aside as tiny paws patter across violet light, leaving paw-shaped echoes that evaporate before reaching yellow. Halfway across, the hare pauses, rotates both ears to face opposite horizons, then continues at an unhurried lope until it vanishes into a glimmer that resembles dawn's preview trailer. In the notebook, one visitor, species lagomorph, demeanor polite, destination unclear. Heimdall reshelves the notebook in an invisible pocket his cloak is said to contain. More pockets than there are pine needles in Vanaheim. A claim nobody has counted, but everyone accepts because counting pine needles would disrupt Vanaheim's tranquility. High above, clouds drift like unambitious parade floats, each carrying fewer spectators than participants. One cloud is shaped suspiciously like a butter churn, another resembles an instruction manual missing its middle pages, and a third looks exactly like the concept of tomorrow but refuses to elaborate. Heimdall watches them drift, not because he must, but because watching is what he does, and he finds even non-events oddly fulfilling. If he notices your eyelids beginning to droop, he would probably offer you a polite nod of encouragement. After all, guardianship includes guarding dreams, and drowsiness is an acceptable form of passport on this bridge. He lifts the lantern, shuffling its glow across the prismatic surface to coax a faint scratch into self-healing. The scratch obliges with excellent manners, sealing itself until only someone very bored or very dedicated could point to where it had been. Heimdall thinks the color band responsible tonight, it was yellow and yellow, modest as usual. Implies it was nothing more than timely reflection. Conversation between watchmen and wavelength concludes. The way conversations at late-night diners end without official punctuation, merely a nod, a refill, then silence. One imagines Heimdall is the sort who refills his own coffee cup, then thanks himself for the service. Midnight slips, quietly into what poets might romanticize as the small hours, though to the bridge they are just more moments to exist. Somewhere, behind the horizon, a rooster practices the crow it abandoned earlier, this time settling on a decibel level barely above a murmur. Heimdall hears it, records first bird rehearsal, and makes a mental note that Dawn is considering clocking in early. The bridge responds by sharpening its colors a fraction sharp in the way velvet can appear sharper when brushed against. The grain, red deepens, orange warms, yellow hums, the cool colors cool, and somewhere a line between green and blue debates whether to introduce teal as a guest hue. The debate ends amicably, as all good debates should at this hour. Annoying. Creak emerges from beneath a distant star, but Heimdall identifies it as the sound of the cosmos adjusting the mattress of space-time. Nothing to file in the notebook tonight. He steps to the central span, places his palm on a translucent node, and feels the entire arc vibrate with the steady heartbeat of existence. It is a calm rhythm, somewhat slower than a lullaby, somewhat faster than a glacier's sigh, perfectly suited to coax thoughts toward weightlessness. Should your own thoughts drift in parallel, let them. The bridge will keep watch. Faint light now lifts from the curve of the world, the kind of light that prefers to slip backstage before the main performance. Heimdall inhales, catching a trace of distant sea foam, perhaps a molecule or two of pine, and the unmistakable scent of someone in Midgard warming yesterday's soup for breakfast. He cracks the smallest smile guardianship extends to. Soup appreciation and writes, son contemplating arrival. Recommend continued vigilance. With that, he folds the notebook closed, not tightly, just enough to suggest more pages await. The bridge brightens fractionally, like a dream deciding to remember itself. Colors sharpen but remain velvety, and the lantern at Heimdall's side dims in acknowledgement, its job nearly done. He lifts it, blows out the flame. The smoke unwinds into dust-colored ribbons that tangle briefly with indigo, then dissipate without complaint. Jalahern rests against his hip, silent and untroubled tonight. No alarm will sound louder than a whisper. A single dewdrop forms at the tip of red, hesitates, then slides slowly toward orange, gathering a soft spectrum on its path until it vanishes with a sigh too gentle to replay. Should you choose this moment to drift fully into sleep, the bridge will not notice your departure. Heimdall already stands between worlds, eyes open, ears tuned to the tiniest rumor of dawn. The rainbow beneath him hums its lavender note, then its choral note, then settles on a chord so quiet it might only be imagined. Somewhere the hare is presumably considering a nap. The clouds have made peace with their shapelessness, and the stars wobble slightly as they prepare to fade. There's no conclusion, only the steady breath of colors held aloft by watchful. Calm, and the assurance that if stories must be guarded, so too must slumber. The hum continues, softer now, until it feels less like sound and more like the absence of worry, stretching ahead exactly as far as you need, and perhaps a little farther, just in case you decide to keep dreaming. Most evenings, if you follow the hush that settles between pine trunks just after the last bird forgets its own song, you may notice a solitary path of flattened moss leading nowhere in particular. At the end of that path, Vidar gathers pieces. of leather so quiet they seem to apologize for existing. He stoops beside a fallen log that has politely volunteered as a workbench, smoothing each scrap against the grain to see which side wishes to face the sky tonight. Somewhere overhead, a cautious breeze turns its pockets inside out, searching for a sound worth dropping and finding none, so it drifts away, muttering that silence is rather heavy to carry. Vidar, the taciturn keeper of unspoken errands, lifts a piece no bigger than a bookmark and studies its edges the way one might study cloud shapes, waiting for the scrap to announce where it prefers to belong. If you are still awake enough to wonder whether leather can be shy, feel free to consider the possibility. Vidar certainly treats it that way. Nothing about the clearing suggests urgency. An owl rehearses half a hoot, forgets the second half, and decides the draft version will do. In the distance, a brook chooses the gentlest route around every stone, as though careful not to disturb their daydreams. Vidar spreads the scraps into a slow swirl, arranging them from palest tan to darkest, umber with the deliberation of someone alphabetizing raindrops. Every color, he insists, deserves its own pause. When a piece curls at the corner, he hums so softly that only moss can hear him moss, for its part, nods appreciatively, and releases a faint scent of old parchment. At his elbow sits a small wooden box filled with beeswax that refuses to melt. Too quickly, bees being considerate that way. He sometimes dips a finger and traces a sleepy rune across a stubborn crease. The rune does nothing dramatic, it merely suggests cooperation, which the leather accepts like a cat being persuaded to scoot. Over 2 inches on the couch dot as moments glide forward in slippers. Vidar fits fragments together, edge to edge, trying possibilities the way an insomniac might rearrange a pillow. A triangle meets an almost rectangle, decides the match feels cramped, and shuffles away to mingle elsewhere. The work has no deadline. The sole of a god's future shoe, destined to press against the jaw of a wolf one distant day, prefers not to be rushed. Vidar keeps a tally in his head, though tally is too energetic a word, of how many scraps would like to commune tonight. Some evenings the number remains blissfully single digit. Other evenings the count drifts upward, but never so high that he must raise an eyebrow. He once considered recording statistics in a ledger, yet the prospect of turning pages seemed unnecessarily athletic for such a calm vocation dot around the clearing. Creatures donate leather remnants with impeccable manners. A fox leaves a strip beside a mushroom, pretending it had no idea the strip fell off its delivery satchel. A raven deposits a square of calf skin after evaluating its softness with the tip of one beak, then flies off to file a mental note under miscellaneous goodwill. Even a wayward troll, famed for louder occupations like bridge lurking, lumbers through at dusk to contribute a thumb-sized patch, apparently convinced such generosity might earn it acquired a reputation. Vidar accepts each offering with a nod so slight it could be mistaken for a blink, then stores the piece beneath a flat river stone to let it acclimate to silence. Should you be counting, you might observe that every donation arrives unaccompanied by fanfare. Even generosity here observes a volume limit dot by moonrise. Vidar tests the seams by pressing edges together and waiting to see whether they enjoy the company. If 2 seams stay politely aligned for the span of 1 deep breath, he rewards them with a thin ribbon of sinew thread. Gently waxed and coaxed through tiny holes, he pricks with a needle carved from a walrus whisker. The needle carries no swagger. It simply appears one evening and has remained politely useful ever since. As the thread glides, it murmurs a soft, sibilant reassurance. Some say the whisper is merely the strand's own fibers catching on themselves. Others suspect the thread has opinions about stitch spacing. Vidar listens either way and occasionally adjusts his rhythm, adding a heartbeat of pause between pulls so the stitches can settle like travelers claiming window seats. Not far from his knee lies a shallow bowl of water borrowed from the brook. Each time a scene completes, he dips 2 fingers, flicks a pair of droplets onto the leather, and watches them shimmer before soaking in. The droplets serve no mechanical purpose. They simply remind the leather that moisture exists somewhere in the world, should it ever feel nostalgic. Nearby, a cricket tries out a single chirp, hears it echo against the hush, and decides to save the rest of the composition for a slightly louder century. Vidar, meanwhile, studies the half-formed soul and imagines how it might feel beneath. Future footsteps. He considers whether the arch prefers a gentle slope or a hint of firmness, then decides to ask again tomorrow when the leather has slept on the matter. Consultation with materials, he believes, is most courteous at dawn dot, as hours tilt toward the smallest ones. A thin mist wanders through the clearing, examining every surface for stories it might carry elsewhere. The mist pauses at Vidar's shoulder, notes his work, and nods as if to say crafting patience is its own weather. He acknowledges the nod by smoothing a palm over freshly joined panels, releasing an aroma reminiscent of sun-warmed barns and distant meadows. Somewhere overhead, constellations test their brightness levels, dimming ever so slightly in solidarity with the workshop's hush. Should a star twinkle a fraction too exuberantly, another star politely nudges it toward restraint. Cosmic courtesies abound under Vidar's patient gaze. The combined scraps now resemble a mosaic more than a shoe sole, yet Vidar sees what could be. The way some people see shapes in tea leaves or potential in half-assembled jigsaw puzzles. He folds the leather slowly, encouraging pliability, and sets a smooth river rock atop the seam so gravity can participate without tiring itself. While waiting, he sips from a wooden cup filled with something between milk and moonlight, flavor, so subtle it leaves only the idea of sweetness behind. If asked, he would say the drink is best described as quiet in liquid form. He places the cup down exactly where a ring of dew waits to greet it. Cup and dew exchange pleasantries, inaudible to anyone lacking the patience to hear condensation persuasions. Eventually, Vidar lifts the stone, flexes the leather once, twice, and deems the evening's progress agreeable. The soul is still more promise than abject, but promises age well in this clearing. He arranges unused scraps into a tidy stack beneath the log, aligning edges so they resemble a polite queue at a bakery that never opens. The needle returns to its shell-carved case. Thread coil nestles beside beeswax, and the brook offers a sigh of approval, possibly just a bubble bursting, but intent matters more than cause. Vidar stands, stretching in increments, and the forest absorbs each creak of his joints like a librarian shelving returns. Before departing, he surveys the clearing to ensure no scrap feels abandoned. Satisfied, he traces a final rune in the era. Simple loop for rest, a line for stillness, and the rune dissolves into the mist, which carries it upward where it might land on a leaf, a cloud, or someone's soon-to-be dream. Vidar steps away, footfalls soft as folded linen, leaving the half-formed soul cradled on its mossy pedestal. The leather, warmed by the press of his hands, cools gradually, memorizing the exact shape of patience. Night deepens, though, deepens. Suggests motion, and night here prefers to idle. The brook continues its half-whispered gossip with stones. The owl postpones a second draft of its hoot, and scraps beneath the log think quietly about future cohesion. Overhead, a meteor appears, changes its mind, and fades back into the darker part of sky. Commitment can wait for another orbit. Vidar's silhouette recedes among trees, cloak edges brushing fern tips that bend and unbend like slow applause dot by the time dawn sends pale scouts through branches. Only a faint imprint in the moss indicates where Vidar knelt. The impression will rise by midday, moss being resilient yet unhurried. The leather mosaic dreams of footsteps it has not yet felt, and the mist, now thinned to silver threads, drifts off carrying rumors that somewhere in a forest clearing patience stitched itself into permanence. Should you awaken later and recall, only fragments, the hush of moss, the whisper of beeswax, the notion that even scraps have destinies, know that the story is still unfolding, slower than breath, quieter than habit, somewhere past the reach of urgency and exactly within the boundaries of sleep. You might not expect a river to keep such tidy hours, yet the gentle stream winding through Sakvabekker glides beneath vaulted beams as faithfully as a grandfather clock that has long forgotten the concept of minutes. Saga sits at the water's edge on a cushion plumped with swan down and polite echoes. Each time the current passes, it bows just enough to acknowledge her presence before continuing on its languid patrol. She leans forward, dipping a modest drinking horn, the color of moonlit ivory into glass clear water that obliges by curling upward to meet the rim. The filling is soundless, so soft that even the horn seems surprised when it finds itself brimming. If your eyelids remain brave enough to stay open, you might notice how Saga tilts the vessel at precisely the angle a sunflower might choose to eavesdrop on dawn. Should you manage to keep listening past the first hush, feel free to think of subscribing to the next lull, though Saga would never mention it aloud. The river does enough whispering for everyone. She raises the horn, not high like a toast, but low, as though presenting it to the cedar benches that line the hall. Those benches, polished by centuries of unhurried conversations, gleam faintly. In appreciation, Saga tastes one thoughtful sip, flavor soft as melted snow drifting through a dream of summer, and sets the horn upon a small stone table. The stone has spent most of its existence perfecting flatness, an art underappreciated outside sleepy halls. Tiny droplets beat on the horn, rolling down in slow choreography before pausing on the rim of a carved rune that means something like contentment and perhaps a second helping. Saga smiles at the rune's modest optimism, then reaches for a reed-woven basket filled with limestone marbles no bigger than hazelnuts. She swirls her fingers through them, listening to the faint clack that resembles distant hail on a long-forgotten rooftop, and selects one marble solely because it appears willing. The marble's destiny tonight is simple. Find the deepest point of the stream and measure its stillness. Saga rolls it across her palm, hums a note that refuses to settle on a key, and lets the marble drop with a whisper splash. Rings ripple outward in slow pulses, patting the hall's wooden columns on their reflections. She counts each ring until the numbers become shy and wander off. Somewhere between 8 and forever, the ripples fade, satisfied that stillness is still in residence. In the hush that follows, Saga opens a slim journal bound in birch bark, its pages softened by years of near-daily indifference to urgency. One page already boasts a single line: water coherent, mood drowsy, marbles cooperative, and she adds another: ripple count respectable, recommends softer lanterns after dusk. Her handwriting drapes across the bark like ivy too, lazy to climb. A gentle lantern glow flickers beside her, fed by oil scented faintly of pine so as not to disturb anyone who dreams of forests. Shadows settle into corners where they hold symposiums on how best to remain unnoticed. Saga tilts her head, listening for the faint creak of rafters shifting in sympathy with the water's sigh. When the wood obliges, she answers the small nod, a dialogue so muted that even silence must lean closer to overhear. Somewhere behind her, Odin may or may not be poring over runes, but tonight he keeps to himself, leaving the hall to Saga and her quiet census of ripples. She is not alone, of course. Tranquility has a way of filling empty space until it feels perfectly furnished. After a moment, she reaches into the basket again, retrieves a second marble, this one marbled blue, gray like a storm reconsidering, and rolls it around her thumb, letting it absorb the room's hush. Instead of dropping it, She holds it up to the lantern, watching light tunnel through translucent layers until it emerges as a meek sparkle on the far side. Saga whispers an anecdote. Some marbles prefer conversation before immersion. This. One appears undecided. She offers a promise that the stream is warmer than it looks, then grants the marble the freedom to fall. The splash is half a size shorter than the first. Ripples declare their presence, then, finding no argument, fold back into the current. Saga notes in her journal, second marbles socialized prior to entry. Ripple cadence nearly identical, perhaps marginally more philosophical. Beyond the edge of her vision, silverfish glide between columns of amber light, each fish carrying an expression that suggests an appointment somewhere infinitely patient. Their tails flick in single-syllable rhythms, reading poetry written on the underside of the water surface. Saga watches without staring, the way one listens to a lullaby already known by heart. She wonders or pretends to wonder whether fish ever become self-conscious of perfect timing. If they do, they hide it well, continuing to synchronize as though unaware synchronization exists. A gentle chuckle threatens to rise, but instead drifts away like loose dandelion fluff. Time passes or reclines into the second scene. The lantern dims itself in quiet respect for whatever moment it thinks this is. Saga whiffs the horn again, drinks enough to taste the difference between first sip and second, which is mostly the difference between wondering and recalling. She decides the second sip hints at hillside clover and possibly the memory of bell chimes muffled by snow. With deliberate care, she plucks a third marble, this one veined with gold like the idea of sunrise folded into stone. Before releasing, as she sets it on the table and taps it once, the marble resonates with a ping so soft only other marbles would applaud. She offers the marble a short speech about bravery in this context, meaning willingness to sink gracefully, and nudges it off the table's edge. It arcs through air at a pace that can be measured in thoughtful yawns, then greets the stream with subdued enthusiasm. Ripples blossom once more, and Saga smiles at their predictable elegance. Ink poised, she writes, third marble displays musical inclination. Stream responded with chord in B- whisper. She underlines nothing, for underlining feels aggressive tonight. Pages turn slowly, refusing to rustle louder than the water's own hush. Saga scents her quill with a drop of lavender, oil stored in a vial the size of a raindrop. The lavender drifts upward, finds the lantern's warmth agreeable, and settles into the rafters where it curls around beams like a cat choosing a new nap location. Somewhere beyond the hall, wind courts the outer walls but decides against conversation and instead combs. Meadow grass with fingers too soft to flatten a single blade. A subtle shift announces scene 3. The lantern flares, then relaxes, signaling nothing in particular except that it can. Saga closes the basket of marbles, its lid woven tight to imply bedtime. She runs one fingertip along the stream's surface, drawing a line that resists erasure until the current politely tucks it away. That fingertip now cool, she presses it lightly to the horn's rim, leaving a print that will fade before anyone thinks to inspect. In her journal, she writes simply, temperature, comfortably oblivious. Between words, she pauses to watch. Dust motes practice an extremely slow waltz beneath the lantern. Each mote seems partnered with another mote it barely remembers, yet they manage perfect synchronicity, possibly guided by a conductor too small to see. Saga leans back against a cedar post, feeling its bark, smoothed by generations of similar leanings, yield just enough to cradle shoulder blades. In a pocket of her gown waits a single hazelnut that accompanied her here for reasons neither she nor the nut remember. She sets it on the stone table beside the horn, deciding that hazelnuts deserve moonlight too. The nut sits proudly, a small planet enjoying its private solar system of lantern glow. Saga contemplates maiming it, then decides maiming would interrupt the nut's anonymity, which it might treasure. A soft yawn slips from her, unhurried, followed by another so gentle the first seems like rehearsal. Scene 4 arrives the way dew arrives on meadow clover suddenly. Once you notice, it has been there for a while. Saga gathers the marbles she dropped earlier. Each one resurfaces by drifting to her palm, unbothered by the laws of buoyancy when politeness calls. She dries them on linen the color of lullabies, deposits them back into their basket, and secures the lid with a loop of flax string. Ink dries in the journal of its own accord. Pages drift closed without help. She lifts the lantern, coaxing its flame lower with a breath, and shadows sigh gratefully as if they have been standing all evening and may finally sit. Water continues its glide, rehearsing the same phrase of melody it began at sunset, unconcerned. That repetition is its own going nowhere art. Saga takes one final sip from the horn, sets it upside down on the stone so any last droplet can slide out and decide whether to evaporate or loiter. The cedar benches seem to straighten themselves, hoping for a farewell nod. She grants them one, and a faint scent of old cedar chests, those that guard heirloom quilts nobody unfolds, drifts through the hall. Above, rafters settle into positions ideal for listening to silence. The fish at last pause, hovering, like commas awaiting the next clause of dusk. If you are still half awake, you might catch a glimpse of their scales catching lantern light, but more likely the scene will blur into that delicious in-between where details melt into comfort. Saga closes her eyes, but only partly, allowing the river's reflection of the lantern to tumble across lashes. Outside, the stars modulate their brightness to match whatever dream the hall is preparing. Water keeps to its schedule, benches keep to their gleam, and somewhere a marble rests beside its neighbors, pleased to have measured serenity yet again. Nothing concludes. Stories here prefer ellipses to periods. The lantern fades to an ember, the journal waits for dawn's next observation, and the hush folds itself neatly around your thoughts, persuading them to drift the way currents drift. Forward, gently, without any intention of arriving soon. You may not think a shoreline could hum lullabies, yet this evening the beach outside Nerd's quiet hall breathes in such gentle huff. Notes that even the waves seem to rock themselves to sleep before reaching the sand. A single gull, too, drowsy to commit to flight, balances on one leg beside a slanted post and blinks as though measuring the distance between one moment and the next. Jared watches from a weather-soft bench, his cloak smelling faintly of salt that wandered. Inland for the company. When he leans forward, the bench obliges with a slow creak that sounds suspiciously like approval. He lifts a palm-sized conch, tilts it just so, and asks it politely whether it still remembers the taste of distant currents. The shell answers with a hush that could be imagination or tide trapped in spiral walls. Either way, Njerd nods, satisfied the conversation will do. If your eyes remain awake enough to wonder whether shells hold grudges against shorelines that keep them waiting, feel free to imagine they forgive quickly. Forgiveness, like seawater, covers quite a lot. Farther along the sand lies Nedard's evening project, a modest row of wave-delivered shells, sorted from palest blush to the nearly purple hush of twilight clams. He kneels, smoothing the damp sand with fingertips that move at the speed of pondered commas, arranging each shell, at an angle meant to please morning sunlight hours from now. Between placements, he pauses to scrape a fingertip over one shell's ridges, counting faint grooves the way some people count sheep, except these grooves have no intention of jumping fences, merely waiting for attention. Every 10th groove earns a murmur of praise, every 12th an inexplicably tiny chuckle, as if the shell faintly tickled his sense of symmetry. A pocket-sized ledger rests open beside him. One page reads, "High tide delivered courtesy bouquet, 10 cockles, 3 augurs, 1 guest star scallop, each entry accompanied by a doodled wave that looks more like a sleepy worm but carries the spirit of waves nonetheless. Ink dries instantly in the salt kiss breeze, which is considerate because Jerd dislikes blotches. They remind him of storms, and storms remind him of raised voices. Dusk drifts deeper, tugging mauve across the horizon. The goal decides both legs are now optional, tucks its head under one wing, and leaves the world to solve its own geometry. Jerd retrieves a small brass compass, not because he needs to know direction. Every direction here points to water, but because the compass needle enjoys whispering magnetic gossip. Tonight it trembles slightly toward northwest, so he pivots the entire row of shells, 3 finger widths in that direction, explaining that a good display respects not only the sun, but also invisible forces too polite to brag. He slides a lone moon snail shell into the lineup, notices its spiral curves wobble toward imperfection, and smooths a bit of wet sand under its base like a footstool offered to a noble guest who never stands. In the ledger, moon snail feels shy, given seat cushion made of tide memory. As the first scene fades, the second arrives on a hush of cooler air that tastes faintly of kelp and upcoming midnight. Jerd reaches into a wicker basket where driftwood pieces rest like half-read letters from the sea. He picks one skinny branch, strokes its grain, and declares it a pointer. Every beach curation needs a pointer, even if only gulls will notice. With leisurely ceremony, he plants it upright beside the shell parade, tilts it a breath south so it appears to be leaning in to admire the scallops, and ties a ribbon of seagrass around the tip. The ribbon flutters with exaggerated subtlety, practicing dance moves fit for an audience already dozing. A hermit crab ambles by, pauses near the pointer to consider property acquisition, then continues onward after determining the mortgage payment in grains of sand might exceed its budget. Niger thanks the crab for its expert appraisal. The crab declines comment, having left its press agent at low tide. The lantern that hangs from the bench post decides to wake from its earlier nap, emitting a glow the shade of warm oatmeal. Light slides across sand, polishes shell ridges, and sneaks into tide pools where tiny shrimp blush under sudden attention. Jared uncorks a glass bottle filled with seawater infused with a single drop of honey. He claims the mixture tastes like summer's footnote. Taking a sip, he tilts his head, adjudges the sweetness acceptable, and offers the bottle a seat next to his compass. Utensils appreciate companionship. He then selects a clamshell shaped like an off-schedule, ellipse, and taps its edge against another shell, coaxing a note barely louder than memory. Somewhere beyond the breakers, an answering clink sounds, perhaps another god-polishing coral, or perhaps just 2 rocks settling an argument about proximity. Either way, Nided marks a tally in the ledger under shell conversations, promising. Scene 3 drapes itself over the beach, threading silver through sand grains that never complain about wardrobe changes. Jerd tests the waterline with his bare heel, determining the tide is in a listening mood. He drags one toe through the edge of froth, sketching a spiral that uncoils behind him, and the sea obligingly smooths it out, the way a caretaker fluffs pillows after guests rise. Gazing seaward, he spots a lone seal head bobbing like a punctuation mark at the sentence end of horizon. The seal blinks, perhaps proofreading the evening, and slips away. Behind Nedger, the lantern sighs, the gull snuffles in its downy shrug, and a distant buoy rings a note that cannot decide whether it wants to finish ringing. Jerd picks up a small flat stone, flips it in his palm, and pockets it for tomorrow's unknown purpose. Stones adore contingency plans. He returns to the shell parade, folds sleeves, and begins the patient task of coaxing each shell half a fingertip deeper into sand, just enough to anchor them against midnight breezes. Not enough to hide their modest pride. With every gentle press, he exhales a small cloud of salt fog breath, and the shells, interpreting this as applause, hold still in modest satisfaction. He tests spacing with the compass handle as ruler. Should a gap exceed tranquility's tolerance, he nudges the nearest shell sideways until balance hums again. In the ledger, spacing audit complete, Gull approved without verbal endorsement. The Gull's endorsement consists of remaining asleep, which around here counts as rave review. Scene 4 arrives wrapped in starlight, so fine it feels like powdered calm sprinkled over everything willing to sparkle. The Gull finally opens. One eye decides the stars require no commentary and re-enters sleep. Jared clicks the lantern with glower, allowing shadows to paint larger silhouettes of the shell row across the sand, shapes that resemble stretched notes of a lullaby printed on sheet music too lazy to stay straight. He folds the ledger shut, slips it beneath the bench where night can read it at leisure, and sprinkles a pinch of sand over the cover, sealing it with unofficial wax made of quiet intention. The tide creeps a single whisper closer. Foam fingers curl near the first shell but pause, respectful of curation. Jared speaks a word that means approximately, tomorrow is patient, and the wave retreats, leaving behind a frill of bubbles that burst one after another in deliberate succession, like applause slowed for emphasis. He gathers the now empty basket, shakes out stray grains, and sets it upside down so any passing shore breeze can use it as a pillow. The lantern flame, sensing concluding duties, shrinks to the size of a punctuation dot ending a sentence you plan to finish later, then holds there. Waiting .njort settles onto the bench, feet buried ankle deep in the still warm sand, and listens while his shell parade absorbs starlight in dignified increments. Some shells glow faintly as though remembering day. Others remain matte, content to be night's matte accents. Above, constellations shuffle their stories to feature a cameo by a brand new twinkle. So small, even the compass needle shivers. In greeting, Jared closes one eye, then the other, yet keeps hearing the hush of waves numbering themselves, one after barely one over and over, until counting loses interest in itself and stops. Nothing concludes, shells still align, tide still debates approaches. Stars still whisper their scripts, and if your thoughts choose to follow any one of these soft rehearsals, they may wander gently along a shoreline that always knows exactly how to lull, never how to hurry. You might not expect a courtroom to yawn, yet this morning the long, low hall of Glitnir exhales a ribbon of frosty breath that hangs in the doorway like an unhurried welcome. A single shaft of sunlight slips through a high window, touches the silver roof beams, and drizzles down the gold-veined pillars with a lazy enthusiasm of honey dribbling from a spoon that forgot where breakfast went. Forsetti strolls across the flagstones in slippers soft enough to make dust feel overdressed, carrying a wax tablet no larger than a nap. He pauses to greet each bench-wide planks of ash polished by centuries of timid elbows and the benches. Creak back, not in protest but in recognition, the way library chairs sigh when a familiar reader returns. If you are still awake enough to wonder whether justice can smell faintly of fresh parchment and damp pine, take a gentle sniff. Glitnir's silence is seasoned with both. Forsetti sets the tablet on a marble lectern whose veins resemble river, maps trying to remember where they left their tributaries. From a pocket, he produces a reed stylus trimmed so short it can't decide whether to be a quill or a toothpick. Tonight it will be both, scratching slow runes that mark who has come to speak and who has come only to listen. The first name he inscribes belongs not to a warrior or a merchant, but to a small breeze that claims another breeze borrowed its whistling tune without attribution. A second line records the rebuttal. The tune, says Breeze 2, was public domain, carried freely by pine needles for anyone with ears to borrow. Forsetti nods, pleased. Disputes about intellectual breeze property tend to stay congenial. perfect for mornings when the echo of his own footsteps still lingers like a half-remembered lullaby. He gestures almost absent-mindedly toward a stone basin at the chambers. Center, the basin fills itself by collecting drips from an invisible spring in the ceiling. Each drop lands with the soft tick of a wall clock that values understatement. When both breezes swirl above the basin to mortal eyes, they are no more than a shiver in torchlight. They settle into complementary breezy curls, like two question marks resting back to back. Forseti watches, waiting for the water's surface to offer an opinion. After 3 drips, the ripples align into concentric rings of perfect symmetry, which everyone understands means please share. Breeze 1 offers 2 measures of whistle. Breeze 2 concedes a half measure borrowed by habit. Both depart satisfied, having discovered collaboration feels remarkably like winning. Forseti writes in miniature runes, case closed, Breeze. Cooperation recommended for future compositions, then blows gently on the wax until it cools into a modest shine. The hall drifts into its second hush, a deeper note colored with mid-morning gold. A sun-flecked patch creeps along the floor until it reaches a low table holding a single clay mug. Steam rises in a spiral so intentional it appears choreographed. Forseti takes a cautious sip somewhere between warm milk and the idea of chamomile and places the mug back exactly where the steam left off, so the spiral can continue without losing its place. A pair of ravens flutter to the lintel, feathers ruffled as if they overslept their own gossip. One raven caused a grievance about misallocated breadcrumbs at yesterday's council lunch. The other raven cocks its head, feigning innocence. Forseti whiffs a palm, invites them to perch on twin brass hooks near the lectern hooks shaped like question marks, because questions here always have seating priority. Raven arguments rarely require more than a glance. He simply tips the mug so a drop of warm milk splashes onto the flagstone. Both birds hop down, sip in alternating turns, discover the droplets taste precisely like shared victory, and forget to cough further accusations. The stylist notes, breadcrumb jurisdiction, shared custody, review in 6 seasons. Outside, a silver blue sky stretches itself like a freshly aired quilt. Light filters through the high window at a new angle, tickling motes of dust into slow pirouettes. Forseti lifts his gaze, tracking one illuminated speck as it drifts toward a pillar, pauses on a sunbeam ledge, then floats away as solo dancer refusing applause. Somewhere near his feet, a length of twine rolls in on a draft, claiming to represent 2 fishermen who tied their nets together and can no longer recall which knot belongs to whom. Twine seldom speaks clearly. Its language is loops and phrase. So Forseti invites the twine to drape across a low pedestal in the center aisle, where soft light can tease hidden patterns from its fibers. With patient fingertips, he tugs one end, then the other, until the knot remembers its own intentions and undoes itself. Twine straightens with grateful slack, promising to remind the fishermen that a shared catch tastes sweeter when nobody keeps. Score. Into the wax he writes, net not reconciled. Fishermen encouraged to label strands politely mixed season. The hall whispers into early afternoon, a time when echoes grow drowsy and benches warm beneath unseen hearth fires. 2 timid shadows glide across the threshold, shadows only. Their owners delayed asking permission to reserve seats for a dispute about missing echoes and a mountain pass. Forseti gestures to an empty bench. The shadows nestle together like folded scarves and wait. He unrolls a scroll, its parchment faintly crinkling with dreams of being a lake on a windless day. The scroll lists questions submitted by moss patches complaining that alcoves are too heavy after rainfall. He files the scroll under tomorrow, which in Glitner translates to any moment after contentment decides it has room for more. Meanwhile, his mug refilled with what tastes like barely awake. Vanilla sends curls of steam that draft new patterns against the pillar faces, every swirl an informal fresco. A lull slides in, softer than silence, stretching from one golden pillar to the opposite silver lintel. Forseti sets the stylus aside to listen. In this lull, he can hear the distant rub of glacier against mountain, subtle as parchment turning. He hears the sigh of pine sap warming in afternoon sun. He hears, somewhere behind the hall's heavy doors, the tiny click of snowflakes changing dance steps mid-fall. All these sounds arise, seeking no judgment, only acknowledgement, and Forseti grants it by letting each breath leave his lungs slow enough to match the drift of dust above the lectern. If your own breath joins this tempo, the hall will notice only to approve. When twilight tiptoes over the sill, torches along the side walls flicker awake, shedding amber halos that wobble like ink spots in a mild earthquake. A final petition arrives. 3 empty grain sacks want to determine who among them shall be first reused when harvest returns. Forseti weighs each sack's weave, noting subtle sturdiness in the one stitched with red thread. He listens to the sacks rustle their cases, rustling as sack for we present exhibits. Deciding fairness smells faintly of cinnamon, he sprinkles a pinch from a clay jar into each sack's mouth. The sacks relax, corners drooping in unanimous satisfaction. Apparently cinnamon is all the hierarchy they required. Stylus etches. Sacks share cinnamon, rotate duties, cooperation ensured. By pleasant scent, darker hues pool across the flagstones and Glitnir sighs again, closing its mouth of light. Forseti sets the wax tablet on a shelf precisely aligned with the shallow beam. Shadow cloaks it gently, the way velvet drapes a violin that has played. Enough lullabies for one evening. He extinguishes all but one torch. Its flame lingers, ember small, so night has something to hold on to. Benches shift almost imperceptibly, settling for their own slumber. The ravens, already forgotten on their hooks, become silhouettes against deeper shadow. One gives a half snore, possibly dreaming of unclaimed breadcrumbs tumbling forever through a sky that never stops serving lunch. Forseti walks the hall once more, fingertips brushing pillar after pillar, thanking gold for gleaming courteously and silver for keeping cool. At the doorway he pauses, listening for any leftover dispute, any unresolved whisper. None rise. Beyond the threshold, the air smells of cedar smoke and far-off frost, a combination that implies stories will keep until another quiet day. He steps into that promise, leaving the single torch to flicker itself into a memory. Inside, the wax tablet rests, stylus sleeping beside, tidy runes cooling under the weight of decisions so gentle they barely dented time. If your thoughts drift now, they may find themselves strolling those quiet flagstones, reading verdicts written in lavender hush, discovering that justice, when practiced slowly, with gold pillars for bookmarks and a mug of steam to annotate, pauses can feel remarkably like a lullaby that never quite finishes its final chord. You might not imagine a single silver needle could keep time, yet in Fensalir this afternoon, the slender tool in Frigg's fingers taps the loom's wooden frame with such quiet regularity that even the sunbeam arching through the high window steals a moment to sink its dust-mote dance to the rhythm. The goddess sits on a low cedar stool that has memorized the curve of her spine. Every gentle creak from its legs sounds like a confidant clearing its throat to agree. In her lap lies a square of soft wool the color of rain clouds, trying to remember how to drizzle, and through it she draws threads so fine it resembles mist caught napping. If your eyes manage to stay open past the first sweep of needle, feel free to wonder whether wool enjoys being turned into stories of its own future. Frigg will never say, but the thread sometimes hums as though answering. A shallow basket rests beside her, brimming with skeins dyed in tones of half-ripe berries and politely diluted sunsets. She pinches one strand of pale lavender and lays it across the fabric, letting it settle where twilight might someday feel at home. The needle dips, resurfaces, and draws the lavender in, stitch by unhurried stitch, forming a curve no larger than a sparrow's wing. Between motions, she pauses to smooth a ripple from the cloth, releasing a sigh so soft it feels borrowed from someone else's dream. Somewhere behind her, a hearth fire crackles in minimal syllables, too drowsy to form. Full words. A clay pot hangs above the embers, steeping herbs that smell faintly of honesty and mountain rain. Steam rises in leisurely scrolls, drafting letters nobody will read, but everyone will breathe. Outside the hall, a swan passes the open doorway, neck arched like a question mark seeking punctuation. It glances in, perhaps assessing the progress of destiny's embroidery, then decides the future can wait and resumes gliding across the reed-ringed pond. Frigg's needle catches a strand of gold, slides it beside the lavender, and pulls until the two colors sit shoulder to shoulder in whispered companionship. She murmurs a remark about balance half to herself, half to the tapestry, and the gold thread seems to nod, kinkless and calm. In the far rafters, a cobweb trembles when a breeze tiptoes through, yet no dust falls. Even neglect in this hall prefers to wait politely. The goddess dips her stylus carved from walrus tusk into a tiny ceramic inkwell, noting a slim ledger. Lavender meets gold, no disagreement, stitched tension at contentment. Soon the sunbeam shifts, nudging afternoon toward a softer palette. Scene drifts into its second hush as Frigg lifts a spool dyed the delicate green of pine needles, pretending to be mint. She weighs it in her palm, then unwraps just enough to sketch a slender arc above the gold curve, something like the memory of a hill that never quite materialized. A faint giggle escapes when the thread knots itself midair, playing coy. She loosens it with a fingertip, telling it serenely that tangles are merely daydreams caught too tight. Across the room, a lark, feather lost from a visitor's cloak, months ago chooses this moment to flutter off a shelf and land on the loom's edge, offering color counsel. Frigg thanks the feather, tucks it beneath the spool, and resumes sewing at the pace of a lullaby, practicing. Understatement. If you listen closely, you may hear another sound beneath. The needles whisper, the faint tick of a water clock tucked. Behind a curtain, counting out thirds of moments instead of seconds. Every drip echoes inside a slender glass bell, and each echo encouraged the stitches to align with something resembling resolve. Yet nothing about the scene hurries. Even the clock appears relieved to mark time in lowercase. Frigg dips the stylus. Again records. Green slope accepted, feather consult received, time cooperating. Evening begins to pool quietly across the flagstones, coloring them with diluted peach and smoky violet. In this third, deeper hush, Frigg rises to fetch a bundle of unspun flax hanging near the window. The bundle carries the scent of last year's meadow long after snow has covered the real thing. She splits the flax into gossamer strands that gleam like moonlit spider silk, then spins them together with her fingertips, creating threads so pale it almost refuses definition. Back at the loom, she arcs the smooth thread through the fabric, letting it drift over lavender, gold, and green like breath held across a song's softest measure. Outside, frogs begin rehearsing their night choir, each croak situated respectfully between the others, leaving roomy pauses for stars still waiting to appear dot with each new stitch. The tapestry gathers weight not of mass but of possibility, as if each color were a polite opinion lining up to be heard. Frigg pauses to sip from a small wooden cup of warmed buttermilk spiced with something barely adventurous. The flavor drifts across her palate, registers approval, then reclines. She sets the cup down and turns the loom just slightly so shadows fall more evenly. A single spark pops from the hearth, landing on the stone hearthstone before fading, too shy to scorch anything. In her ledger, she writes, "Moon thread settled, hearth approves, frogs second the motion." Night finally drapes itself across. Pencilier, seen slipping into its fourth and softest register. Lamps along the wall flare to life, each flame the size of a quiet agreement. Their amber glow spreads over the fabric, urging colors toward a muted harmony that seems almost to exhale. Frigg threads the needle a final time with a strand dyed a shade one might call remembered embers, not quite red, not quite memory then. Lays a gentle curve that meets the moon thread, and chooses not to cross it, respecting boundaries even in abstraction. The strand settles with the contented sigh of a bookmark reclaiming its place. She surveys the square. Lavender dusk, golden whisper, green suggestion, moon thread shimmer, ember echo. None of the shapes declare themselves. They simply coexist, like neighbors who share gardening tips through a hedge but never raise voices. Frigg flicks a wrist and snips the remaining thread, catching the loose end between thumb and forefinger so it cannot unravel. She knots it with a motion so deft it barely appears to happen, then tucks the knot back against the fabric's reverse where it can dream unobserved. Ledger open once more. She records, evening layers complete, silence holding steady. The ink dries at the speed of inevitability. The water clog drips into absence. A moth traces a lazy figure 8 around the nearest lamp, wings muted by dust as soft as parchment edges. Frigg gently rolls the tapestry corner to corner, binding it with a ribbon the color of unvoiced wishes. She places the bundle in a cedar chest already heavy with futures waiting to be told. Before leaving, she sets the stylus across the ledger like a bridge between note and possibility. The hearth fire settles lower. Embers pulse in slow breaths, casting faint constellations across ceiling beams. If your eyelids grow heavy now, they mimic those embers' bright pinpoints ebbing gently into ash-soft dark. Frigg draws the window curtain half closed, letting one slim blade of moonlight rest on the loom's empty frame. A silent promise that threads will gather again when dawn has patience to watch. She steps away, slippers whispering across cool tiles, and the hall absorbs the sound until even absence becomes a lullaby. Out on the pond, the swan drifts beneath a sky full of amateur stars practicing twinkle techniques. Ripples cradle each light until water and cosmos agree to merge reflections. Somewhere between those mirrored skies lies the notion that stories, stitched slowly, can cradle worlds to sleep without needing endings. Should your thoughts wander there, let them keep wandering. The loom will wait, the needle will wait, the ledger will wait, and Frigg herself listening from the hush just beyond. Wherever dreams begin, we'll be pleased to find each future still unfolding in threads, too soft to wake anyone before they are ready. You might not expect a feather quill to rehearse its own breathing pattern, yet in the small timber loft above Valhalla's quieter wing, Bragi lifts one alabaster plume and listens for the faint hush before ink touches parchment, a thin square. A vellum waits beneath his hand, edges curled like a cat settling into a sun patch, and the single oil lamp nearby burns with the easy rhythm of someone drumming fingers on a tabletop, only to confirm the table is still there. Bragi's beard, braided in 2 leisurely ropes, sways a fraction whenever he exhales, as though even facial hair prefers to mark time in half notes. If your gaze lingers long enough to wonder whether poems choose the quill or the other way around, feel free to ponder. Bragi finds the question pleasantly impossible and therefore endlessly restful. A mellow draft climbs the stair and nudges a row of reed, pens lined up on the sill, encouraging them to whisper among themselves about NIB sharpness and ink acidity. Bragi rolls his shoulders, producing a tiny pop that echoes faintly like applause from a far corner of the hall. He dips the quill into a ceramic inkwell, whose glaze reflects lamplight and sleepy ripples, then pauses, allowing the excess ink to form a single bead at the point before surrendering back to the reservoir. First strokes come slowly, a curve, a loop, the suggestion of a stanza practicing its posture. The parchment accepts each line with the mute enthusiasm of freshly turned soil receiving rain. Bragi smiles at the quiet. Drafts, he believes, ought to arrive on tiptoe lest they frighten away the gentler verbs. Outside the narrow window, a sliver of moon bounces on the horizon, pretending not to eavesdrop. Somewhere below, distant laughter from Einherjar off-duty rolls through the beams, but by the time it climbs this high, it resembles the low purr of a contented kettle. Bragi scratches a note in the margin, something about mead barrels debating their own echoes, and chuckles softly when the lamp wick flares, apparently finding the imagery agreeable. He turns the quill sideways to shade a line, creating a gradient no wider than an eyelash. In that precise moment, a grain of dust drifts through the lamplight, decides it enjoys the view, and settles on the ink, embedding itself forever as punctuation too small to name. Bragi nods, accepting the collaboration. The scene eases into its second hush when he reaches for a leather pouch of saffron-tinted sand. Pinching a whisper of grains, he sprinkles them over wet ink, listening to the nearly inaudible patter, like rain rehearsing on distant parchment roofs. Each grain absorbs glisten, then rolls away, leaving letters matte and modest. He tips the page. The sand falls in slow cascades, collecting in a porcelain saucer that hums faintly when struck by each grain. Tiny tones forming a chord for nobody's ears but the loft itself. Bragi sets the saucer aside, pockets rubbing, together with a faint swayed sigh, and returns his attention to the stanza now resting comfortably. From a hook near the rafter hangs his harp, its maple frame tinted honey by years of lamplight. He plucks a single string, letting the note expand until it drapes the rafters like a silk scarf. String vibrations nudge the reed pens, coaxing a soft rattle that answers as percussion. Bragi closes his eyes, tests the harmony of inked words. Against the fading note in his memory, finds them nearly aligned, and decides a minor adjustment might render the difference charming rather than incorrect. He scratches a tiny caret, inserts one patient syllable, then wipes the quill on a strip of linen already speckled with verse footprints. If you tilt your head just right, you might hear the new consonant nestle into place like a feather joining. A well-made pillow. A breeze returns bearing the faint aroma of rye bread from the kitchens below. It curls under Bragi's manuscript, puffing pages just enough to mimic an epistolary sigh. He smooths them again, whispering thanks to the breeze for its editorial enthusiasm, and continues. The lamp surrenders a tiny curl of smoke that threads ceiling-ward, outlining cobweb highways before dissolving into shadows. Each spider strand gleams for half a heartbeat, then fades, leaving the loft no brighter, yet somehow more aware of its own architecture. Scene 3 drifts in. When Bragi reaches for a second sheet, this one faintly thicker, ideal for a refrain that prefers sturdier footing. He taps the quill twice against the inkwell rim ink drops ripple, then settle before tracing slow arcs that will later sound like river water negotiating pebbles. Halfway through a line, he pauses to scratch his beard, inadvertently twanging a small bronze bead at the braid tip. The bead rings a tiny bell tone that ricochets off timber beams, startling a slumbering moth into brief flight. The moth flutters across lamplight, casting tiny winged shadow tremolos on the page, then lands on the harp's tuning peg, as if offering to hold the next note until needed. Bragi quietly appoints it assistant conductor. He adds a metaphor about twilight tucking clouds into pockets, then chuckles when a stray syllable insists on rhyming with itself. Rather than fight, he adjusts phrasing so the self-rhyme feels intentional, the literary equivalent of a cozy echo. Ink flows thinner now. He dips again, coaxing the quill to drink without haste. Outside, the moon finally decides to climb. fully into view, casting silver onto the parchment edge like a bookmark left by night itself. Bragi allows the light to sit there, unblotted. Silver margins, he muses, lend poems the dignity of quiet applause. A gentle creak signals the loft door, opening 2 inches enough for a shallow tray to slide through. Bearing a clay cup of elderflower tea and 3 oat biscuits stacked like compliant ellipses, a servant nowhere to be seen closes the door again. Hospitality here has perfected invisibility. Bragi sips, noting how the tea's warmth pulls a sigh from the quill feathers still clinging to his fingertips. He breaks 1 biscuit, allowing crumbs to scatter across a section of unused parchment. The crumbs arrange themselves into a shape resembling the Midgard serpent napping with its tail outside the border. Amused, he flicks 1 crumb away, shortening the serpent just enough to imply it has decided on a diet. Scene 4 arrives wrapped in pocket-sized stillness. The lamp dims as oil recedes, flame shrinking to a soft pearl of orange. Bragi unhooks the harp, rests it across his knees, and plays 5 notes with pauses long enough to fit small dreams between them. Each string releases a vibration that seems to massage the very spine of the loft. Dust motes rearrange their choreography to better reflect the melody's skeleton. Satisfied, he sets the harp aside and studies the completed stanzas, reading them aloud in a whisper barely louder than parchment turning. Syllables roll off his tongue, land on beams, and linger, as though considering permanent residence. He makes 1 last change, a humble comma reposition to ease breathing space, then leans back. Hands folded over the harp's curved shoulder. Ink dries, tea cools, the moth resumes its sleep on the tuning peg. Bragi bundles the pages, slides them into a linen envelope, and seals it with wax stamped by a signet depicting 2 quills crossing like mellow swords. He sets the envelope atop a stack of previous night's verses, each stack no more than a dozen lines, not in any hurry to be read. At the edge of the writing desk lies a pebble from the river Ifing. He places it atop the new envelope, anchor against mischievous drafts. The pebble, smooth and unassuming, seems quietly flattered. By the responsibility the lamp sputters a final approval. Bragi pinches wick to darkness, letting afterglow hover in memory a fraction longer. He stands, spine uncoiling with soft increments, and steps toward the loft window. Stars beyond the frame sparkle like punctuation marks waiting for sentences. He cracks the casement. Cool air slips in, carrying a hint of iron from distant shields stacked for tomorrow's exercises. He inhales, lets the coolness settle behind his sternum, then closes the window so the poem can keep warm. Quill cleaned, harp rehung, pages anchored, Bragi descends the stairs, each tread softly announcing its own patience. The loft remains. Behind him, settling back into timber hush. Outside, the moon hums a low note that vibrates across rooftops, wrapping halls in gentle resonance. Ink, dust, parchment, and tea begin their slow overnight conversation, each remark separated by minutes of silence, which in this place counts as enthusiastic agreement. If your thoughts wish to linger with them, drifting between shelves of half-finished lullabies, resting on the downy hush that quills exhale, you are welcome to stay. Nothing here concludes. Pages await next night's punctuation. The lamp awaits new oil, and the moth, quite possibly, awaits its debut as a footnote. So let the words keep breathing, let the strings keep humming, and above all, let the silence keep you company until morning chooses its opening rhyme. You might be surprised that a hill can memorize whispers, yet this afternoon Lichtenberg lifts a soft breeze that seems to repeat, word for word, every thank you ever murmured into its grass. Ire kneels on a quilt of moss so cushiony it forgives. Footprints before they finish, and she sets out 3 shallow birch trays, each lined with linen the color of watered milk. Sunlight saunters through birch leaves, dappling the cloth in freckles that drift whenever branches shift, as though the light itself were practicing subtle choreography. She unties a pocket stitched inside her apron and releases a polite tumble of dried petals mallow. Euro Angelica, so they land with sighs small enough to disappear into afternoon hush. If your eyelids hover open long enough to wonder whether herbs gossip about the ailments they once soothed, you may sense a hush laugh in the way a yarrow stem refuses to lie perfectly straight. Ire chooses a sprig of feverfew, holds it to her ear like a seashell, and listens. After several unhurried heartbeats, she nods. Apparently satisfied, the stem has confessed its strength ratio for the coming brew. She places it onto the first tray, far left corner, aligning its tiny daisies to face west where the sun will fold. Later, her quiet way of letting light kiss each petal goodbye. Behind her, a stream shaped like a silver ribbon decides to pause its babble, switching to a quieter burble as if aware a conversation of leaves is in session. With 2 fingers, Ire coaxes a clove of sweet Sicily into alignment beside the feverfew, remarking under her breath that bitters like to keep company with gentle sweet notes, the way a stern lecture pairs nicely with a padded chair. She lifts a clay jar sealed with beeswax. The lid sighs open, releasing the shy aroma of dried lumwort, which smells faintly of library dust and drizzle-soaked bark. 1 pinch, then a second, lands on the next tray too, likes its ingredients spaced wide. She claims to discourage unnecessary mingling before the water warms. A bumblebee drifts past, wearing pollen trousers of such bright gold it could give fashion advice. It bumps into a sprig of thyme, apologizes with a polite buzz, and continues toward a patch of clover where deadlines are rumored non-existent. Ire chuckles, jotting a mental note to test whether time feels more confident after compliments. Scene drifts into its second hush when a distant lark discovers a new note, tries it twice, and then shelves it for later. Ire reaches beneath the moss quilt, retrieving a shallow basket woven from reeds that once grew where moonlight puddles at low tide. Inside rest pebbles smooth as lullabies, each labeled in soft chalk with names like head cool, chest ease, sleep kind. She sets the sleep kind pebble onto the 3rd tray. Herbs will be sprinkled around it, forming a halo calibrated to coax streams from behind reluctant eyelids. A pocket of warm air ambles up the slope, rearranging the petals just enough to resemble punctuation marks seeking a sentence. Without flashing any surprise, Ire gently tucks a stray marigold back into its row, murmuring that enthusiasm is welcome but order prevents jealousy. From her satchel emerges a slender wooden spoon carved from rowan. Its bowl, no larger than a sparrow's footprint, fits perfectly into a jar of powdered valerian that has been dozing since dawn. She scoops 1 measured cloud, lets it drift over the center tray like slow snow, then taps the spoon twice on the jar rim. The taps echo down the hill, bouncing off trunks with decreasing ambition until only the moss remembers them, and moss, as ever, keeps quiet. Ire folds the spoon into a linen square for later washing, though washing here means introducing it to the brook and allowing water to hum away any residue it finds curious. Mid-afternoon light arcs gentler now, encouraging scene 3 to unfold in a tone closer to a hum than a narrative. Ire lifts a tiny bronze kettle from its hook on a tripod crafted of willow. Inside, water collected at dawn rests so calmly it might blush under scrutiny. She sets the kettle on a cushion of coals banked in a stone circle. The stones glow with leftover morning warmth rather than showy flame, content to heat things. Slowly enough that time gets a chance to watch. As the first filament of steam curls upward, she sprinkles 3 grains of salt into the water salt. She says, invites herbs to tell the truth about their bitterness, while the kettle murmurs. She opens a vellum notebook edged in faded blue ink. 1 page reads, tested horehound with honeycomb, sigh result satisfactory. On a fresh line, she writes, Lifteberg, Midsummer -2, feverfew greeting angle westward, marigold curious, time flattered. Her handwriting wanders gently, as if trying not to wake any letters already asleep. A dragonfly darts overhead, its wings catching sun sparks. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the sparks seem to land on the notebook line, but they vanish, leaving only the impression of excitement too brief to tire anyone. The kettle begins its quiet rattle, signaling readiness. Ire lifts it with a cloth. That smells of rosemary smoke, then pours a thread of water onto each tray just enough to moisten, never to drown. Herbs release vapors you might call sighs if vapors could produce syllables. She leans in, inhaling notes of resin, meadow, and something faintly reminiscent of old quills stored in cedar chests. Satisfied, she adds a fraction more water. To tray 3, persuading the sleep-kind pebble to share its coolness with Valyrian dust. Steam mingles around her braids in halos that catch sunlight, forming ghost rings above her head before drifting off to find less reverence. Scene 4 arrives wrapped in a hush-tinted rose and pale gold. Ire lifts the first tray, tipping its contents into a glazed earthen pot shaped like an oversized acorn. Petals swirl, stems settle, and water furls around them, eager for infusion. She sets a clay lid atop the pot, aligning 2 rune marks so steam can escape along a path approved by whoever first mapped comfort. Next, tray 2 empties into a narrow-necked flask wrapped in linen. Bitters prefer privacy, she notes. Narrow. Next, keep them from boasting too loudly once they meet honey later on. Tray 3 she does not empty. Instead, she holds it aloft, allowing sunset's first blush to mingle with the vapor rising. When the vapor thins, she stirs the contents with a slender twig of ash, then sets the tray down near a tuft of wild chamomile because dreams, like chamomile, thrive on modesty. Herb steep. Light fades. The brook resumes its normal chatter, now confident it won't interrupt. Ire folds her apron seams precisely, trapping stray crumbs of petal in pockets where they'll continue releasing scent. She carries the acorn pot toward a low bench carved out of a fallen oak. Placing it there lets moonlight later test the brew for silver undertones, which she claims improve clarity of morning memories. The narrow-necked flask finds its place on a stone ledge, soon to be diluted with a spoon of clover honey once stars flicker fully awake. She returns to the trays, swirls remaining droplets with her fingertips, then flicks them into the moss. In a semicircle, each drop sinks silently, though one might swear a faint glissando lingers where water meets green. Notebook open again, she adds. Infusions resting, moon invited to audit. Ink dries almost instantly because dusk. Air here understands cooperation. She closes the book, slips it into a leather pouch, and fastens the clasp with a toggle shaped like a sleeping leaf-closed books, she thinks, deserve covers that remind them to rest. By now, the hill's shadows lengthen like slow handwriting. Across parchment, Ire stands, brushes moss from her knees, and surveys the small field hospital of trays, pots, and flasks settling into their own nocturnal courses. A night thrush trills once, as if testing acoustics, then folds silence. Around itself like a thick scarf, Ire gathers her empty basket, notes how the reed weave smells faintly of damp hay, and tucks a leftover thyme sprig into its rim tokens. She insists, help baskets feel purposeful even when empty. Before leaving, she kneels once more, placing both palms on the moss to thank Lifteberg for its discretion. The hill responds with a temperature so even it could be mistaken for stillness. She rises, takes 3 steps down the slope, and hears behind her the kettle exhale a final puff of steam like a sleeper adjusting blankets. Everything now begins the slow, fragrant task of turning water into comfort, a process measured not in minutes but in deepening breaths. Should you drift somewhere between her footsteps and the stream's burble, let your thoughts steep alongside. Valerian, feverfew, and time, swirling in water that remembers dawn and forgives dusk. Dreams may join like gentle understudies, waiting for cues already spoken by petals and pebbles. No conclusion beckons here. The brew will wait until morning. The notebook will yawn open when curiosity returns. The pebble will cool tray 3 all night long. And Lifshaberg, practiced in patience, will keep rehearsing every whisper of gratitude it has ever stored, just in case someone needs to hear it back. You might not expect a ribbon to rehearse how it should lie in a drawer, yet this morning Phila lifts one slender strip of gold-threaded silk, lets it drape over her wrist, and listens for the almost inaudible sigh that tells her the fold is content. A pale beam of sun sneaks through the half-open shutters of Fencelier's quiet side chamber, brushing motes of dust into soft spirals that appear delighted to audition for the role of dawn. The room smells of cedar chests, linen newly aired, and the faintest memory of pressed lavender that once dozed between pillowcases. If your eyes stay open past the first hush, you may notice how every plank of floor seems to remember footsteps only as distant echoes. Never as Mark's dot, she sets the ribbon on a low work table polished by decades of equally gentle tasks. Beside, it waits a wooden caddy containing spools dyed in colors shy enough to resemble whispered compliments. Cloud gray, muted honey, and something not quite rose, not quite dusk. Phyllis' fingertips hover above each spool, selecting them in an order that feels less like choice and more like letting the threads volunteer. One spool rolls half a turn forward, apparently eager, so she secures its loose end with a tiny bronze. Pin ribbons, she believes, appreciate a light handshake before service. Somewhere in the hall beyond, a quiet footstep pauses, decides conversation can wait, and tiptoes away, leaving the chamber to its slow choreography. She draws the shutters wider with a motion so smooth the hinges choose not to squeak, allowing a rectangle of tempered light to land across a cedar chest, carved with intertwining branches. That chest, entrusted with Frigg's lesser-worn gowns, has earned the right to nap undisturbed. Still, Fulla lays a palm upon its lid, acknowledging its long shift as guardian of fabric dreams. She lifts the latch, which clicks like a distant pebble dropped into calm water, and the lid yields to reveal neat stacks of folded linen. Each stack wears a lavender sachet the size of a sparrow's heart, sewn from scraps too small for ribbons, yet too fragrant for waste. Fulla smiles, retrieving the sachets one by one, testing their scent with brief inhales, then fluffing them as gently as one might wake a very polite cat from a nap. A slow curl of breeze glides through the shutters, sampling the lavender, then continues on to carry news of Linen's contentment to whoever cares. Perhaps the moss along Fencelier's garden wall. Perhaps nobody at all. Fuller replaces the sachets, aligning them in a subtle curve so no two corners form stern angles. She lifts a gown whose fold lines have softened overnight. The fabric slips through her hands like water practicing stillness. She shakes it once, sending a muted billow of air that rustles the ribbons on the table just enough to remind them not to fall asleep. The gown drapes over a dowel balanced between two backs of chairs, where daylight can trace its hem for unseen blemishes. Fulla examines each stitch, finding none in need of correction, and rewards the gown with a single thimble. Tap upon its pleat a tiny last good, luck charm before it returns to rest. The scene eases into a deeper hush as Fulla moves to a smaller chest tucked beneath the window. This one holds Frigg's shoelaces and slender ankle ties, modest treasures compared with jewelry, but no less worthy of ceremony. She unlatches the lid. Hinges sigh in gratitude for the attention. Inside, coils of cord rest on padded velvet, sorted by shade from soft cream to faint amber. She picks a pair that glimmers like bottled sunrise, then sits on a low cushion and begins the ritual of smoothing each length across her knee. The cord hums against wool skirts, straightening filament by filament, as though recalling the first time it learned to lie flat. Every few passes, Fulla glances at the spindle clock on the far wall. Its lone hand creeps so patiently that minutes seem to yawn open into quarters of stillness. Time here practices understatement. Tasks adjust their pace accordingly. Cords lie perfectly parallel. She knots one end of each into the faintest loop, no larger than a grain of barley, ensuring they will thread through gilded eyelets without drama. She slides the cords into a cloth sleeve embroidered with a single rune that offers safe passage runes. After all, enjoy being involved in even the quietest logistics. The sleeve joins several others in a shallow drawer beneath the table, each labeled in ink that smells of pine and steady intent. Fulla closes the drawer with a breath's worth of force, and the latch settles like a bird folding wings that mid-daylight shifts, announcing the second small ceremony, polishing a silver clasp that secures Frigg's traveling cloak. Fulla retrieves the clasp from a velvet sachet, turning it so the light kisses its surface in slow bands. With a square of buckskin barely larger than her palm, she rubs gentle circles, coaxing last week's fingerprints into memory instead of smudge. The cloth picks up a whisper of tarnish, darkening at the edges in proof of diligence. Fulla pauses between circles to listen, not for sound, but for stillness, making sure it remains intact despite the tiny friction of silver beneath leather. Satisfied, she breathes warm fog across the metal, then makes one final pass so it gleams, like a secret almost told. She sets the clasp on the ribbon she chose earlier. The two seem to greet each other in mirrored shine, soft as friends exchanging inside jokes. A delicate chime drifts up from somewhere in the courtyard, a ladle against a cauldron, signaling midday meal preparations. The note disperses into wooden beams, becomes part of the chamber's own pulse without urging haste. Fulla unwraps a seed cake from wax linen, takes a small bite, and chews with an air of private accord, crumbs staying politely attached until she brushes them into her palm for later disposal. She sips from a clay mug of barley flour water, its faint sweetness reminding her of washed linen drying in sun. Taste settles like a bookmark, marking the moment but not insisting on recall. Sunlight reclines toward afternoon, and Fulla's next task unfurls, inspecting the spindle clock's rope weight. She stands on a low stool, steadying herself with fingertips against the wall, then eases open the clock's narrow side door. Inside hangs a cord wound neatly around a smooth stone, burnished by decades of gravity. She checks for phrase, finds none, and whispers a greeting to the stone objects she notes, respond kindly to acknowledgement. She descends, closes the door, and the clock resumes its barely audible talk, a sound soft enough to be mistaken for a deep breath. Scene drifts again, inviting late daylight to slide gold coins of brightness across the floorboards. Fulla approaches. A wicker basket containing oddments, mismatched glove, stray button, a strip of brocade having lost its twin. She sorts through, contemplating futures for each item. The glove she pairs with a newer maid whose stitching begs for gentle reinforcement. The button she threads onto a loop of flax twine for safekeeping. The brocade she folds twice slips into the mending satchel. Someday it will become trim for hand towels, elevating their humility. Decisions made, she ties the satchel closed with a twist of unbleached yarn and stores it beneath the cedar chest, where it will dream of usefulness. Now the room senses its final hush, the hour when afternoon exhales and evening inhales in the same shared breath. Fulla gathers the ribbon and polished clasp, wraps them in tissue so thin it rasps like quiet wind through reeds, then seals the bundle with a dab of beeswax softened between thumb and forefinger. She sets the package atop the cedar chest, aligning, It precisely with a carved leaf motif symmetry helps silence keep its balance. She closes the chest. The latch clicks, sounding less like closure and more like gentle acknowledgement that order has been restored for now. She folds the linen on the work table, extinguishes the lamp's flame until only a red bead remains, and watches as smoke curls upward, drawing invisible calligraphy she chooses not to read. A final glance assures her that every ribbon lies where it meant to. Each cord sleeps content, and the spindle clock navigates time at a trot slow enough for daydreamers to keep pace. She dusts her hands, smoothing invisible chalk from palms, then turns toward the door, slippers murmuring over boards dot as she steps into the corridor. Fading light slides behind the shutters, tucking stray motes back into dusk. The chamber settles, storing its hush like a lidded jar labeled, quiet while folded. Ribbons recall their rehearsal folds, silver-clasped dozes beneath silk tissue, cedar chest savors lavender dreams, and the spindle clock pursues its next minute with languorous courtesy. If your thoughts choose to linger, they might rest on the ribbon's unfurling sigh, glide alongside dust motes in slow dance, or drift with that clock hand as it tiptoes across a horizon only it can see. No ending disturbs the calm, full of will. Return at sunrise, the ribbons will be waiting. The hush will know precisely where it left off, and you, should dreams weave their own soft ties around your breathing, may wake to find every fold kept its promise to remain gentle throughout. The night. You might not expect a wave to practice its inside voice, yet this evening far below the moon-tipped swells, Agir's undersea hall murmurs so softly that even shy plankton pause to eavesdrop. Pearly lanternfish drift in clusters beside, columns of sculpted coral, their glow flickering like slow applause while the sea, giant lifts a ladle longer than a harpoon and stirs the surface of a vast bronze cauldron. The brew inside a mellow, kelp-colored ale answers with one lazy, bubble at a time, each bubble rising just high enough to glimpse the vaulted ceiling before sighing back into the mixture. If your eyes can remain open through that first drowsy swirl, you may notice how Agir counts the bubbles under his breath the way some people count sheep. Though here the flock is understandably damp, Ram reclines nearby on a chaise grown from living shell, her netting needles clicking with the faint precision of distant rain on roof slates. Every third stitch she pauses, lifts the thread to the lamplight, and nods when its silver glint approves the tension. The net she nurses tonight is not intended to snare. It is a lull merely meant to drift like a polite curtain through. Quiet currents, so migrating herring may brush against it, and remember to adjust their pace to something nearer a lullaby. Tiny sea stars perch along the chaise's edge, rotating their rays in half circles as though keeping tempo. Somewhere behind them, a spiral staircase of mother of pearl rises toward the kelp-shaded windows, but the stairs are empty. Revelers rest elsewhere, leaving the hall to its hush. Agir's ladle completes another slow arc, lifting a ribbon of ale that drapes back into the pot without a splash, already drowsy from its own ascent. He mutters a line of praise, half recipe, half lull, and reaches for a pinch of powdered coral kept in a shell that once taught seagulls about echo. The coral dust sifts onto the liquid surface, dissolving in languid spirals that fade before. Deciding on color, Agir loves this moment when seasoning settles so gently that flavor seems to dream itself awake. Off to one side, a row of tankards waits upside down on a slab of sea glass, their handles aligned like notes of a chord that refuses to resolve. Each tankard has been polished with shark skin until it no longer reflects shape sharply enough to startle drowsy guests. Rand's needles pause. She glances toward the tankards and flicks one finger in approval, the motion sending a glimmer of phosphorescence scooting across their rims, like moonlight skating on quiet pavement. A subtle title. Pulse rolls through the hall, enough to sway suspended braids of seagrass that serve as banners along the walls. This gentle stir marks the second drift of the night, the hour when currents growing tired of the surface choose to nap at depth. Aegir sets the ladle onto its granite rest and lifts the cauldron lid just a hand's breadth, letting aromatic steam escape in a sigh that smells of malt and seaside mornings. The steam rises, meets cooler water above, and condenses into pearl-sized droplets that drift down again like thoughtful punctuation, landing on his beard in shimmering commas. He closes the lid, content that flavor has nowhere better to wander, then shuffles toward the tankards, the ripple of his footfalls scattering a cluster of sleepy shrimp, who float off muttering apologies for occupying the floor. Ram threads one. Last loop through the net and knots it with a flourish modest enough to be mistaken for a coincidence. She folds the finished panel across her lap, allowing it to ripple slightly in the passing tide, so it can memorize the feeling of gentle motion before performing unsupervised. From a pouch of sea cloth, she removes a cluster of tiny shells, each bored through to form a bead no larger than a raindrop. One by one, she slides them onto a fringe of the net, humming a melody so soft it barely qualifies as sound. The shells chime anyway, catching stray vibrations that wander by looking for conversation. When the final bead settles, she lowers the net onto a bench carved from driftwood and checks that no thread feels ignored. The bench creaks in fluent barnacle, assuring her all is satisfied. Aegir, meanwhile, lifts the first tankard, tilts it to greet a nearby lanternfish, and watches golden reflections tumble inside its hollow. He fills it only halfway, believes. The top half of any vessel should belong to aroma. The ale pours thick as a daydream and thinner than nostalgia, gathering an obedient cap of sea foam that murmurs stories about gulls and distant piers. He sets the tankard back on sea glass, fills a second, then a third, each time angling the pour so tiny eddies swirl clockwise, aligning with the hull's slow turning currents. By the sixth tankard, the pour has perfected itself into a gesture, closer to ceremony than labor. Ran watches, unspooling a narrow ribbon of eelgrass she intends to tie around each handle, not to mark ownership, but to remind thirsty champions that every sip owes courtesy to tides and patience. A hush deeper than the earlier hush drapes over everything, signifying the third, sleepless stretch of the night. Far above, the surface may still host the moon's silver torchlight, but here only dim glow remains, punctuated by the occasional wink of bioluminescence along coral shelves. Ram rises, her gown streaming behind like a flag identifying a country. That decides its borders anew with every tide. She circles the cauldron once, listening for any bubble out of step. Finding none, she dips a tasting shell shaped exactly like half a whisper, sips, and smiles, a confirmation small enough not to wake the brew. She whispers to Aegir that barley dreams sweetly this year. He grunts agreement, so soft it resembles a scent from a distant whale. A final task strolls into motion, seeding the foam. Aegir plucks a carved branch of drift alder from a niche in the wall. Its forked end resembles a tuning fork, mindful not to sing. He skims it across each tankard, coaxing the foam caps to settle in smoother curves. The foam obeys, dimpling, slightly as pockets of air exhale. Lanternfish hovering closer, entranced by froth's faint glow. Ran ties her eelgrass ribbons round the handles, weaving tiny knots facing outward, easy for fingertips to find without effort. She tugs one loop, ensuring it will not slip when condensation gathers like patient applause on polished sides. When the last ribbon rests, both hosts step back, hands folded, admiring how the tankards form a modest constellation across the sea glass. Counter. Nothing announces that the ale is ready. Readiness here is a matter of atmosphere rather than proclamation. Around them, pillars of coral hum in sub-audible harmony, and strands of kelp sigh like curtains acknowledging a breeze. If by chance you are still half awake, you might feel the hall's hush lean closer, inviting your pulse to match its gentle decrement. A new current glides through, bringing the faintest rumor of dawn filtered through leagues of water. An Agir lowers the hall's lanternfish, signaling their shift ended. The giants step away, leaving ale, nets, tankards, and lull currents to continue their silent work of soothing whatever drifts near. The cauldron keeps warmth, the ribbons keep memory, the foam keeps its delicate arch, and Rand's net, resting on driftwood, waits for first light to rise above the waves before unfurling into open sea. No farewell disturbs the quiet, only the slow fade of footsteps, the soft click of needles tucked into a shell, and the echo of bubbles counting themselves back to sleep. Should your thoughts choose to hover here, let them curl like foam around the lip of a gentle wave, breathing with the pace of tides that have nowhere else to be. For even when surface day returns and champions Gladdersteins and louder halls, this chamber beneath remains committed to a brew that bubbles politely, a net that catches nothing harsher than dreams, and a hush that deepens into the kind of silence you can almost hear singing long after you have drifted into your own ocean of rest.